Honey is supposed to be one of the few foods untouched by industry. Yet in recent years, laboratory testing and import inspections have revealed something unsettling. Many products labeled pure or raw do not match the chemical profile of real honey. Some contain added syrups, others show traces of residues that should never appear in a natural hive product. Across markets from the United States to the European Union and New Zealand, regulators have issued recalls, tightened labeling rules, and questioned the origin of blended honeys. What looks golden and familiar on the shelf may come from multiple countries filtered until no pollen remains or heated so aggressively that its natural enzymes disappear. Today we'll open 5 honey brands you should avoid, names linked to recalls, adulteration risks, or misleading labels. And for your sake, we'll also reveal 2 that truly honor what honey is meant to be: clean, traceable, and authentic. On Queen Bee Gardens. In July 2025, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration released a public notice about a Class 2 recall involving several batches of Queen Bee Gardens whipped honey. The company had discovered tiny fragments of stainless steel that might have slipped into the product during mixing. No injuries were reported, and the company acted quickly to pull the jars from stores and online shelves. This was not rumor or speculation, it was an official record. The affected jars were made in early summer between June and late July, each marked with a batch code printed on the lid. Customers were asked to stop using those lots and contact the producer for a refund or replacement. That kind of quick, transparent response deserves credit. But it also opens a quiet question: how does something like metal find its way into something as simple as honey? Queen Bee Gardens is a small family-run business in Wyoming. For years, their whipped honey had a loyal following: smooth texture, mild flavor, good story. But small production can bring its own set of risks. In their own report, the company explained that the fragments likely came from a worn part of a mixing blade. When you rely on compact, manually operated equipment, even a minor vibration or bit of friction can cause metal wear over time. It does not take much. In practice, a Class 2 recall means the issue isn't expected to cause serious harm, but it still shouldn't be ignored. Honey may seem naturally safe. It resists bacteria and lasts for years, yet that doesn't protect against solid particles. Once a physical contaminant enters the jar, all that natural stability no longer matters. It's a reminder that food purity is not only about ingredients, but about what touches them along the way. There's something important in how the company handled it. They detected the problem, reported it, and informed the public. That's how food safety is supposed to work. Perfection isn't possible, accountability is. When a brand tells you exactly which lots to check and how to reach them, it shows a level of transparency that's worth acknowledging. For regular buyers, this recall is a simple cue to stay alert. Look at the date stamp before trusting the label. If you see a jar labeled whipped or creamed, make sure there's a visible lot code and contact number. If that information is missing, it's safer to skip it. The color and consistency of honey tell you almost nothing about its safety, the paperwork does. After the recall, Queen Bee Gardens announced upgrades to their mixing equipment and added extra inspection steps before bottling. Whether that keeps the problem from happening again will depend on regular maintenance and outside verification. But at least there's now a clear record of what went wrong and what was done to fix it. For anyone who keeps a jar of this brand at home, the takeaway is simple: check the batch code. If it matches the recalled lots, stop using it and ask for a replacement. And if it doesn't, there's still a broader lesson to keep in mind. Honey isn't just sweetness in a jar. It's a product of care, of checks, of traceable steps that keep it safe from hive to shelf. Check the code, not the color. 2. Walmart Great Value Raw. In early 2025, a U.S. federal court ended a lawsuit questioning whether Walmart's raw honey was truly raw. The case, filed by consumers in Illinois, argued that excessive heat and filtration made the label misleading. The judges dismissed it, finding no evidence of adulteration or deception under federal law. The verdict was clear, but it left a gray area. What does raw actually mean when it comes to honey? In agriculture and food regulation, there's no single nationwide definition. The word often implies unheated, unfiltered, and natural, but the law only requires the product to contain genuine honey, not necessarily pollen enzymes or microscopic traces of hive material. For most shoppers, that distinction is invisible. Walmart's Great Value line includes both raw and organic raw honey sourced from multiple regions and packaged for affordability. While the product meets labeling standards, it may still go through light pasteurization or fine filtration to prevent crystallization and improve shelf life. Those steps make the honey look clear and uniform, but they also remove some natural pollen and alter the texture slightly. It's not contamination, it's processing. Meanwhile, independent researchers and beekeeping groups point out that filtration and heating above certain thresholds can affect authenticity markers. Pollen analysis, for example, is used by food laboratories to trace origin. When pollen is removed, verifying the true source becomes nearly impossible. By contrast, smaller producers often leave microparticles intact, resulting in a cloudier product with faster crystallization, but more traceable identity. Even so, Walmart's position is not unique. Many national brands follow the same refining process to ensure product consistency across millions of units. From a commercial standpoint, uniformity matters. Buyers expect the same color and clarity every time. But for consumers seeking genuine raw honey, that same uniformity can be a warning sign. The smoother and clearer the honey, the more likely it has been processed at higher heat or filtered through pressure systems that strip natural residue. Therefore, the most practical takeaway is not about lawsuits or technicalities, it's about verification. Look for honey with third-party certification or published handling standards. A true source, certified or certified raw mark when available, shows that the supply chain has been audited for origin and heat treatment limits. If the jar doesn't list processing details, assume it's been filtered and lightly heated, even if labeled raw. The case also highlighted a broader challenge in food labeling. Words like natural, pure, or raw sound straightforward, but carry no strict legal definition. For regulators, that flexibility allows fair marketing. For consumers, it breeds confusion. Clarity in the end doesn't come from the front of the label, it comes from what the brand is willing to document. For shoppers who buy honey primarily for health or authenticity, understanding this gap is crucial. True raw honey often looks cloudy, thick, and may crystallize within months. It might even have small flecks of pollen or wax near the bottom of the jar. Those imperfections are not defects, they're evidence of minimal processing. Walmart's product isn't unsafe or fraudulent, it's simply standardized. It serves convenience, not tradition. Knowing that difference helps you choose based on purpose, clear for storage and cooking, opaque for authenticity. In the end, the label raw means many things to many people, but only testing and traceability make it real. 3. Aldi private label honey. You might remember the small glass jar on your grandmother's shelf, thick, cloudy, and gone by winter. It never looked perfect, but it tasted alive. Today, the honey aisle feels different. Long rows of identical golden jars, everyone clear, smooth, and quietly affordable. You've probably reached for one without thinking. That affordability has a story. Across Europe, supermarket chains have become the largest honey distributors on the continent. Their private label products, especially those sold by Aldi, move millions of jars each year under names that promise pure or natural origin. On paper, that sounds ideal: local shoppers supporting regional producers. Yet the reality behind the label is rarely so simple. In early 2024, a German television investigation tested dozens of supermarket honeys using a new laboratory technique that examines molecular fingerprints, a kind of DNA-style authenticity test. Several samples from large discount retailers, including Aldi, were marked as likely adulterated. The data suggested traces of added sugar syrups derived from rice or corn. The amounts were small, and the findings were not part of any legal action, but the implication was enough to make headlines. Yet scientists quickly pointed out a complication. The testing method, though innovative, was under validation. It can flag irregularities even in genuine blends when floral composition varies by region or season. In other words, the method could overinterpret natural diversity as contamination. Aldi, for its part, stated that its suppliers meet all European Union food safety and import standards, and that every shipment passes both in-house and external quality checks. No official recall followed. In reality, the controversy revealed something larger than a single laboratory result. It showed the cost tension built into modern honey production. Genuine single-origin honey is expensive to harvest and limited by geography. Supermarket demand, however, requires volume consistency and price control. To fill that gap, processors combine multiple sources, heating and filtering the mixture to maintain one uniform texture. The result looks beautiful, but loses the subtle differences that once told you where the nectar came from. For consumers, that trade-off can feel invisible. The product is safe, sweet, and affordable. But it's also harder to trace and nearly impossible to authenticate once blended. Price becomes the only certainty left. And over time, that convenience reshapes expectation. We start believing that all honey should pour the same way, taste the same way, look the same way. Lastly, the issue is not about villains or fraud, as much as about transparency and balance. Aldi's honey meets the minimum legal bar, but those rules were written for a world before large-scale blending. The lesson here is practical low price does not always mean deception, yet it nearly always means compromise. If you want to know what you're truly eating, check the fine print. Look for a clear statement of origin country names, not regions or phrases like blend of EU and non-EU honeys. The longer that line of text, the farther your jar has traveled. The old jars your grandmother kept were not flawless, but they told the truth in their texture. They set naturally turned opaque and carried the memory of one place, one field. Modern jars trade that story for polish and volume. Neither is inherently wrong, but only one can tell you where it came from. Cheap can be honest, but it must be proven. For little private label honey. How many countries can one jar of honey claim to come from? It sounds like a riddle, but it's printed on supermarket shelves across Europe. The label might read blend of EU and non-EU honeys, a phrase so broad it could mean anything from Spain and Hungary to China and Turkey in the same bottle. Under European Union law, that wording is legal. It tells consumers that the product combines honey from several sources, at least one from within the EU and one from outside. What it doesn't tell is proportion, season, or route. 2% might come from Germany, the rest from overseas, and the label would still meet compliance. The rule was written to simplify trade, not to ensure transparency. Furthermore, global supply chains make tracing individual origins extremely difficult once blending occurs. Honey collected in one country is often bulk shipped to another for filtering, pasteurization, or packaging. Each transfer adds a layer of distance between the hive and the final label. For retailers like Lidl, which sell enormous volumes under their private labels, the system works efficiently. Large importers handle the logistics, standardize flavor, and stabilize prices. But efficiency has a cost. Visibility fades with every added hand in the chain. By comparison, small-scale beekeepers can document the precise region or even the floral source of their honey. Their jars might carry phrases like acacia from Hungary or lavender from Provence, each backed by local inspection. Large chains rarely have that luxury. To guarantee price consistency across thousands of stores, they need blends that remain uniform year-round. Those mixtures often include honey from several continents, making any single origin claim impossible. The law allows it, and the average shopper may never notice. The jar looks neat, the content is safe, and the label seems official. But behind that legal clarity hides a practical fog. If a contamination issue arises, tracing which country supplied the affected honey can take months. Regulators must work backward through shipping documents, processing plants, and export certificates, a bureaucratic maze that few consumers ever hear about. In the end, it isn't fraud so much as a system built for scale, not specificity. Lidl's private label honey complies fully with EU regulations and routinely passes safety inspections. Yet those rules were designed around trade flow, not consumer comprehension. The words blend of EU and non-EU honeys meet the legal threshold while offering almost no useful information about what's actually inside the jar. For anyone trying to buy honey with real origin integrity, that gap matters. It doesn't mean the product is unsafe or synthetic, only that its identity is collective, not personal. Think of it like a crowd photograph. Everyone's face is technically there, but none stands out clearly. So what can you do? Read the label closely. Look for a specific country name, not a continental blend. If you see produced in followed by one nation, that usually signals single-source packaging, even if the nectar was imported. If the label lists multiple regions or uses vague phrasing, treat it as a global mix. The fewer details offered, the longer the supply trail tends to be. Honey, like any natural food, carries the story of its place. When that story is replaced by a paragraph of trade language, it loses more than flavor, it loses context. 5 writes Manuka honey. In a single laboratory test from New Zealand last September, One jar of Wright's Manuka honey showed glyphosate levels above the national limit. The number 146.7 parts per billion stood out not because it was catastrophic, but because it crossed the country's maximum residue level of 100 parts per billion. For one, glyphosate is not a mysterious substance. It is a widely used herbicide found in many agricultural systems, and trace residues occasionally appear in crops or soil. In honey, those traces usually mean that bees foraged near recently sprayed farmland. The limit exists not because any presence is inherently dangerous, but to ensure that cumulative exposure remains low and controlled. Wright's Manuka honey has long been positioned as a boutique single-region producer from Kirikiri, emphasizing natural harvesting and traditional extraction. The lab test in question came from a single retail jar purchased by a private advocacy group, then analyzed by Hill Laboratories, a reputable New Zealand facility. Importantly, it was one sample, not an official government recall or a regulatory warning. That distinction matters. A single jar does not define an entire operation, yet it can reveal weak spots in oversight. Nevertheless, the result touched a sensitive nerve. Manuka honey occupies a special place in New Zealand's national identity and export economy. It commands high prices abroad precisely because it is marketed as clean medicinal and carefully monitored. When even one sample exceeds the residue threshold, questions ripple through both consumers and regulators. How consistent are testing programs? How often are random jars checked after export? And how transparent should the findings be? As noted by the Ministry for Primary Industries, most New Zealand honeys tested over the past decade remain well below the maximum residue limit. The system works, but it works by averages, not by absolutes. Residues can fluctuate between hives depending on wind drift, soil persistence, and timing of local herbicide use. In essence, purity becomes a moving target. What one jar reveals might never appear in the next. For Wright's, the path forward is the same as for any responsible producer: trace every batch, tighten supplier boundaries, and publish test data openly. Transparency after the fact does not erase an incident, but it builds long-term credibility. And for consumers, the key is learning how to read the numbers rather than the headlines. A result of 146.7 parts per billion does not imply toxicity. It shows that monitoring systems are working, that someone is checking, measuring, and disclosing. Therefore, rather than seeing this case as a failure, it can be read as evidence of vigilance. Food safety depends on detection, not denial. What gives confidence is not perfection, but proof. When producers share analytical data, they invite accountability. When they stay silent, speculation fills the gap. For ordinary buyers, the takeaway is simple. If a brand offers batch numbers and publishes residue reports, that's a mark of trust, not suspicion, if it doesn't ask. In a marketplace crowded with promises of purity, verified transparency is the only language that counts. Honey can carry traces of the world it comes from fields, flowers, and sometimes the chemicals used to manage them. Knowing those traces doesn't ruin the story. Eventually, numbers decide, not narratives. After 5 brands, the pattern becomes clear. Most of the problems we've seen aren't born from malice. They come from shortcuts, volume, and the quiet distance between what's promised and what's delivered. Recalls, lawsuits, blends, residues, each tells a part of the same story. When purity becomes a selling point, it's often the first thing to disappear. But that's not the end of the story. Across the same markets, a few producers are still doing things the slower, harder way. They trace every shipment, test every batch, and publish what they find. Their honey isn't sold as miracle medicine or nostalgic sweetness. It's sold as food, honest, traceable, and consistent. These are the brands that rebuild trust one jar at a time. Now let's look at 2 names that keep that standard alive and prove that true purity exists. 6 Convita UMFTM Manuka honey. Open a jar of Convita, and the first thing you notice isn't the color, it's the weight. Slow, dense, quietly alive. The spoon turns almost reluctantly, and there's a depth to the aroma that feels closer to a forest floor than a kitchen shelf. It's a small reminder that some honey still behaves like nature made it. Convita's strength has never been about packaging or slogans. It lies in verification. Every jar that carries the UMF mark, short for unique Manuka factor, comes with measurable chemistry. Those initials are not a logo. they're a test. The UMF standard tracks 3 key compounds: MgO, which gives Manuka its antibacterial properties, DHA, its natural precursor, and leptospirin, the floral fingerprint that proves authenticity. Together they tell you if what's inside the jar was grown, harvested, and preserved correctly. Moreover, Comvita's license number 1019 isn't decorative. It's registered with the UMF Honey Association of New Zealand, a non-profit that audits producers and oversees the testing program. Every batch must pass laboratory checks in accredited facilities before export. Those results are then linked to a batch code printed on each jar, allowing buyers to verify lab data directly through Comvita's website. For a product that travels halfway around the world, that traceability is a rare kind of honesty. In practice, the system goes beyond quality assurance. It acts like a passport. Each batch carries a record of origin, transport, and temperature history. If a shipment ever fails to meet chemical consistency, it's flagged before reaching shelves. The company's transparency page even explains what each rating means: UMF 5, 10-15, and so on, values that correspond to the strength of those 3 key markers, not just taste or texture. As a result, consumers don't have to rely on blind faith or marketing claims. They can cross-check the science themselves. If a jar says UMF 10 points, it means it has passed independent testing to confirm both potency and purity. And because Comvita publishes its license details publicly, the data trail can be followed from the factory floor to the consumer's hands. This is not only about certification, it's about consistency. Manuka honey is delicate by nature. It darkens with age and loses potency if overheated. Maintaining stable conditions through every step requires deliberate care: cool extraction rooms, sealed containers, controlled humidity, and audited storage. These aren't poetic details, they're proof that the pure on the label has structure behind it. Ultimately, that's why Comvita stands out. It doesn't ask for belief, it provides documentation. It treats purity as a measurable fact, not a myth. In an era where almost every jar claims to be natural, Comvita's approach feels refreshing: less storytelling, more accountability. For ordinary shoppers, this matters. When a company gives you the tools to verify its claims, it changes the relationship from persuasion to partnership. You no longer buy the promise, you buy the evidence. And that evidence, printed in small black code near the lid, is what keeps real honey honest. Some brands chase the word pure. This one defines it with chemistry, with transparency, and with the patience to prove every batch. 7 Nature Nate's 100% pure, raw, and unfiltered honey. After all the testing, tracing, and talk of purity, sometimes you just want a jar that tastes the way honey used to. No claims, no gold seals, just the steady scent of something familiar. You've probably passed it before the orange label sitting quietly on a grocery shelf. Nature Nate's built its entire name on that feeling. Not fancy, not foreign, just honest. The company began in Texas more than 50 years ago, started by Nathan Sheets, a man who turned a small backyard operation into a national brand without changing his principle: raw, unfiltered, and consistent. The word raw here isn't decoration, it's a promise of restraint. Each batch is gently warmed, only enough to flow, never pasteurized, and never stripped of pollen. The texture stays thick, the flavor wild and floral, like honey drawn straight from the comb. Unlike most large producers, Nature Nate's still tests for authenticity in 2 directions: first, in-house labs that check moisture purity and trace pollen content, and second, third-party testing through independent facilities in the United States. The results confirm that their honey meets U.S. Grade A standards for quality while preserving natural enzymes. It's science at work, but quiet science, the kind that never overshadows the taste. In fact, the company doesn't claim perfection. Honey is a living product and no 2 batches are identical. What matters is control, the ability to trace where each shipment comes from and how it was handled. Nature Nate's uses a blend of regional sources from across the American Midwest and South, keeping every supplier under strict documentation. That approach allows them to maintain steady texture and flavor while staying within a domestic, transparent chain of custody. Meanwhile, the unfiltered part of the label means something tangible. Most supermarket honeys are filtered under high pressure to achieve that clear amber look. But the process removes pollen and natural particles that define origin. Nature Nate's uses a gentler filtration system, fine enough to remove beeswax and debris, coarse enough to keep the biological markers intact. You can see it in the slight cloudiness, the subtle variation in color. It's not flaw, it's fingerprint. And in essence, what sets the brand apart isn't technology or marketing, it's moderation. They do just enough to keep the honey safe, clean, and shelf-stable without polishing away its character. That restraint has earned them loyal customers who trust what they can see and taste, not what they're told. For that reason, Nature Nates feels like a full-circle moment in this story. After traveling through imports, blends, and recalls, we land back on something domestic, a company that balances scale with sincerity. It's proof that mass production doesn't have to mean compromise as long as there's intention behind every batch. The lesson isn't that certification is unnecessary. Comvita proves how vital verification can be, but trust can also grow from the simple habit of consistency, the same jar, the same taste, the same clear promise to do things right. Sometimes that's enough. Honey in the end is a mirror of its maker. When handled with patience, it stays pure all on its own. Honey has always been more than a sweetener. It's a record of how we treat the land, the bees, and our own patience. The truth is, purity doesn't end at the label. It continues in the choices we make, buying from traceable sources, storing honey away from heat and light, avoiding plastic when glass will do, and never mixing it with boiling water or processed syrups. Each small act protects what nature built drop by drop. If we want honey to stay real, to taste like the fields it came from, we have to meet it halfway. Choose brands that show their tests, support beekeepers who keep things simple, and honor the effort behind every jar. That's how we keep the sweetness honest and make every spoonful, every meal truly worth its while.
This video does not promote division within the United States or encourage segregation. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and fostering discussion based on current events, public sentiment, and social trends. We fully respect the United States Constitution and all federal regulations. If today analysis made you think, drop a comment so we can keep the conversations going. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you will never miss our next independent deep dive.